Okay, so the time I think has come, because I've had numerous requests, to talk about hardcore punk, Terror of Terrors. There's not really a whole lot to discuss, I don't think, so maybe I'll try and get more into like the nitty gritty history of it. It is where post-hardcore comes from, so maybe it's important to note for that reason. I also think this would be kind of like a cool video to make because like I am personally fairly familiar with the 12-tone theory of hardcore video, which I'll link below. And I like that video, but it's a little kind of like outdated. I think like most of the bands that they talk about in that video are like 80s hardcore bands, like really early, even 70s hardcore bands. And a lot has changed, and I guess I can kind of cover some of like what's taken place since the birth of hardcore itself. So really all you need to know about hardcore in terms of like structurally how it works is that it relies very heavily on the power chord. You're probably familiar if you've played guitar before. You know, it's a 1, a 5, and an octave above it. I'm in standard right now because it felt a little cheap to play in a drop tuning, but it's pretty common in hardcore too. The goal in hardcore has kind of always been to take this one movable chord and just kind of like shift it around as quickly as possible, making use of a lot of neighbor tones and atonal stuff and weird scales and all that. And, you know, when it started out in particular, it was more on the side of entirely uninformed by theory or any other sort of school of like rock and roll or less informed. It's become more integrated within other genres. It's taken in influences from other genres since then, and that's a big part of why it kind of sounds different now. You know, I don't think it would be uncommon to hear something in like the early days of hardcore that has almost no scale, just like a, you know, over time people sort of started taking the rhythmic approach, which is making use of a lot of kind of like syncopated feels and using the D beat, which is a really important drum beat that you should go look up if you're not familiar with it. That's critical to hardcore. And marrying that with like more theory over time, which is basically just means like adding in minor scales and stuff, playing more stuff that's inspired by heavy metal essentially. And you started to hear riffs that maybe a little bit more like and over time you maybe started to hear like more like lead tones get added into. And if you don't know the pentatonic scale, it's a classic one. You usually learn it early on in guitar playing, and it's just like a blues scale. You definitely hear a lot of that in hardcore of any age. And yeah, like it's informed a lot of genres and it's forked into a lot of genres. So, you know, you could also get into talking kind of like neo-crust and how it sort of took stuff from like black metal and turned that into like a hardcore style genre, or like melodic hardcore, which is basically just D-beating with shouting and like harmonic chords over it, like pop punk style chords. There's all sorts of permutations. At the end of the day, it's just moving around power chords, usually in like neighbor tones. It's like and the structure of the song is pretty simple. You know, you get intro riff, or maybe you just play the main riff alone, then you play the main riff, which is a meteor riff, and everybody plays along, and then you have the breakdown, which is where things get a little bit slower usually, and the drum beat gets a little bit groovier, and everyone kind of moves around, and that can be kind of like your something along those lines, you know. That's kind of the whole genre. It's really not super complicated. I think if you go and listen to some hardcore bands that you like, you can probably learn some riffs really, really quickly and get into it. There's a reason why it's a popular genre. It's very simple. A lot of people don't want to mess around and they just kind of want to get into playing rock and roll. So there you have it. Give it a shot.